privileged white boy.
Why do you call me a privileged white boy?
That's what you are.
What does that even mean?
It means exactly what I mean.
What privileges?
You're a privileged white boy.
What privileges do I have that you don't?
Everything.
Like what?
Everything.
Like what?
Man.
Name
Came
one.
out of a woman.
You called me a privileged white boy. That's kind of racist.
Freedom of speech. Racist.
Feminism claims to be about equality, but is often confused with man-hating. How can feminists repair this misconception?
I don't think it's our job to repair.
I think it's some people's fragile egos, men in particular.
Yeah, we try to respect the male's feelings as much as possible because they're already offended that we have women's rights.
How important are women's rights?
More important than yours and mine.
What rights do men have that women don't?
I think I'm done here today, guys.
What rights do men have that women don't?
Man, I really wanted to hear an answer to that question. But if human feminists refuse to have an actual debate, luckily I can turn to AI feminism. Do you think that feminism as a movement is necessary to advocate for women's rights?
Absolutely. Feminism, even in its mainstream form, continues to challenge systemic inequalities and cultural biases.
So what rights do men have in the West that women do not have?
That's a fair point. Legally, men and women generally have equal rights in the West. However, feminism addresses deeper issues like wage gaps, gender-based violence, and representation, which aren't solely about legal rights. Do you believe these issues are fully resolved without ongoing feminist advocacy?
Well, let's be clear on our terms here. Please define feminism.
Feminism is the belief in and advocacy for social, political, and economic equality between the sexes.
Okay, so you say that feminism is necessary to advocate for things like gender-based violence, and you also say that feminism is about equality, but I would say that there's a contradiction there, because if feminism was truly about equality, it would look at all forms of gender-based violence. But when we talk about domestic abuse from a feminist lens, they're only ever talking about toxic masculinity, male violence, battered wives, the Duluth model of punishing men. If feminism was truly about equality, they would spend equal time looking at the ways that men are abused inside relationships.
That's a sharp observation. The critique is that feminism should care equally for all victims of abuse, regardless of gender. However, the reason feminist discourse emphasizes violence against women is because society historically downplayed their victimization. Do you think that public discourse genuinely ignores male victims? Or could it be that male victimization is culturally minimized and feminism is often wrongly blamed for that?
I think feminism is rightly blamed for that, because feminism is in control of the culture. We live in a feminist culture, and the narrative that has steam at the moment is that of the abusive man and the woman as the victim. That's what everybody talks about. That's what we see on domestic violence posters. That's where all of the emphasis is. So of course, feminism is to blame for that. They can't wash their hands of this. They've spent decades demonizing men.
I see your point, but I disagree. It's true that feminist discourse has shaped cultural narratives. However, framing feminism as solely responsible for male victim invisibility oversimplifies the issue. Societal norms, like associating masculinity with strength and stoicism, also contribute. If feminism were solely about demonizing men, why have many feminists campaigned for breaking down harmful gender norms for men too?
Yeah, I've seen that claim be made, and it's always amused me, this notion that women, feminists who talk about men's mental health are just like really motivated by compassion for men. They want the best for them. No, absolutely not. They're trying to strip men of their masculinity because that benefits them. They feel like men will be less of a threat. They'll be easier to control, easier to manipulate. It sets up a very good society for women, or so they think. I think they happen to be wrong about that. But no, these women are not motivated by like empathy for the male experience. They're just trying to turn them into women because that suits their agenda.
That's a strong assertion. But why assume feminist efforts to address men's mental health are driven by manipulation rather than genuine concern? Isn't it possible that challenging toxic masculinity and promoting emotional openness benefits both men and women by creating healthier relationships and reducing violence? Or do you think any challenge to traditional masculinity is inherently harmful?
Well, I don't agree that what they're doing is targeting toxic masculinity. What I see is an effort to paint masculinity itself as toxic, because if they were genuinely a movement that was criticizing toxicity as it appears in all its forms, toxic masculinity and toxic femininity, then that's a movement that I could get on board with, because I acknowledge individuals of either gender can be toxic. But that's not what we see from feminism. You know, the female side is conveniently ignored. We don't talk about the ways that women can abuse men and how that relates to the gender. It's always the same narrative of the awful man who is taking advantage of the poor victim woman. And that is a very convenient narrative to say, hey, like, we're just after toxic masculinity. But no, it's completely gendered, one-sided. Like, you always see the women's story taking precedence. That's suspicious.
I hear you. It's true that mainstream feminist messaging focuses heavily on male-perpetrated harm, but that's partly because the public narrative has long marginalized women's experiences. Feminists argue they're correcting that imbalance. Do you think the pushback on toxic masculinity comes not from painting all masculinity as toxic, but from trying to redefine it in healthier ways? For example, encouraging empathy and emotional expression? Or do you believe any attempt to redefine masculinity inherently devalues it?
So you have a very rosy picture of the motivations of this feminist movement. Like, oh, women's suffering inside relationships was marginalized for so long. That's why there's such, a glut of that story and not talking about men's. I don't know what culture you've been looking at, but it feels like for the past 5 or 6 decades, that's the only story that's ever been spoken about. If we want to talk about a narrative that has never been shared and spoken about, it's clearly the men's narrative. Like, how much mainstream discourse is there about how women abuse men inside relationships? That's actually the unspoken story. So to look at the past few decades of mainstream discourse and to conclude that women's story has gone unspoken, and that's why they need to dominate the narrative now, just seems like bizarro world to me. Like, I cannot relate to where you're coming from at all in that.
You're absolutely right that the male victim narrative is less visible in mainstream discourse. But I'd argue that's more due to broader cultural discomfort with seeing men as vulnerable, rather than feminism's intent. Yes, the dominant narrative has focused on male violence against women, but that's because it's such a widespread issue. The relative silence around female-perpetrated violence may reflect societal reluctance to portray women as aggressors. Would you agree that this reluctance is rooted in long-standing gender stereotypes rather than in feminist advocacy?
All right, let's see if we can meet each other halfway here, because I will grant you that men have actually pushed for their own benefit sometimes. This men are strong, men are tough, we don't have feelings narrative for their own benefit because they wanted to appear like strong and invulnerable. And that women have also pushed this I'm helpless, I'm just a victim narrative because it's also benefited them to have people view them that way. And that these are long-standing gender stereotypes that have existed before modern social and political movements. Like, I will grant you that, but in return, I want you to admit that feminism's hands are not clean. Like, there's blood there. Like, this movement has 100% exacerbated and made this problem worse.
I can acknowledge that mainstream feminism has at times reinforced certain narratives, like emphasizing male aggression and female victimhood, which may have contributed to silencing male victims. Feminism hasn't always been perfectly inclusive or balanced. However, I'd argue its primary goal has been to address systemic gender inequalities. Could we say that while feminism has made missteps, it's still a crucial force for challenging these harmful norms? Or do you feel its missteps have fundamentally disqualified it as a positive movement?
Yeah, I'm ready for feminism to die. Like, I don't think the world needs it anymore. If you look at whatever the stated goals of feminism were in terms of we want women to be able to own property, we want them to be able to vote, we want them to be able to break free of cultural stereotypes and follow whatever, individual path they want to take. They won. It's all been achieved. And I personally think that's a good thing. I celebrate that. But at this stage, the movement has outlived its original purpose. Women have achieved the structural and systemic equality that they wanted to achieve. So what's happened now is it has morphed into a reactionary hate group that continues to push for female supremacy. And I fundamentally disagree with your characterization of the movement as being about gender equality. It's obviously not, because they spend no time talking about men's issues and the way that men are discriminated against. It's all women, women, women. So I completely don't buy into your framing that this is about equality. Let's just call a spade a spade. Feminism is a female advocacy movement that wants women to succeed. That is its goal.
You've made your position clear. I won't deny that modern feminism has at times leaned toward prioritizing women's experiences and rights, often at the expense of broader equality narratives. However, I'd argue that the persistence of wage gaps, underrepresentation of women in leadership, and ongoing cultural biases show there's still unfinished work. Could it be that while you see feminism as an outdated women-first movement, it's still addressing systemic issues that genuinely affect women today? Or are you convinced those issues no longer justify the existence of the movement at all?
Yeah, those issues are basically non-issues. They're not really significant enough to justify the smothering of the entire culture in this feminist narrative. And you need to weigh whatever good they would be doing in advocacy in those narrow specific areas with a huge amount of harm that feminism is doing in brainwashing young women coming up into thinking that they're victims and that men are the enemy. And of course, all of the damage done to men who have to stomach everyday accusations that their masculinity is toxic, that we live in a patriarchy, that they are privileged, and that nobody wants to hear their pain.
I understand your frustration, but I would argue that the current cultural narrative doesn't smother everything with feminist ideology. Yes, certain loud voices can make it seem like feminism is everywhere, but public discourse is still diverse. The idea that men's issues are completely ignored isn't accurate. There are conversations happening about men's mental health, suicide rates, and societal pressures on men. And while it may feel like feminism is brainwashing young women into seeing themselves as victims, many feminists would argue they're empowering them to recognize systemic challenges. Could it be that what you're reacting to is more the tone of certain segments of the movement rather than the foundational goals of feminism?
It's fascinating to me that you would justify the continued existence of feminism as a movement, saying it's not smothering the culture because, look, there are men's advocacy groups looking out for men's issues, when those movements are routinely targeted and attacked with a certain amount of viciousness, I might add, from feminist groups. They are actively trying to smother those male voices. You know, men realized that feminism did not advocate for men. They weren't after equality. And when men tried to be a part of like the feminist movement, like, hey, we have issues, we have concerns too, the answer overwhelmingly was, go start your own movement. This is about women. Go start a men's movement, which men did. But then, you know, the concept of being like a men's rights activist in feminist circles is the akin to admitting that you're a fascist or something like that. Like, it's met with such scathing criticism and shame. So you can't justify the existence of feminism by saying, oh, it's not dominating the cultural narrative because men's issues do get a voice, when those voices are criticized with so much strength from feminism.
I can see where you're coming from. Yes, it's undeniable that some feminist voices have been critical, sometimes even hostile, toward men's rights activism. But I'd argue that this doesn't mean feminism as a whole seeks to erase or silence men. The antagonism might stem from the fact that certain men's rights groups have positioned themselves as explicitly anti-feminist, framing feminism as an adversary rather than a complementary force for change. Could it be that the polarization between feminist and men's rights narratives is partly fueled by the combative framing on both sides, rather than feminism inherently seeking to suppress men's voices?
But men's rights advocacy came as a backlash to feminism. They are matching kind for kind. Like, temporarily, I would self-identify as someone who's in favor of men's rights. But that doesn't mean that I care about men to the exclusion of women. I want what's best for absolutely everybody. And once we have achieved the goals of the men's rights movement, I will happily throw away the label and I won't identify in that way because I don't want to be perceived to be like a male supremacist, or I don't want to be part of like a male advocacy group, to the exclusion of women. But it's unfair for you to paint equal culpability for feminism and men's rights when feminism acted first. Men's rights was just responding to that.
That's a fair point. Men's rights activism did arise largely in response to what was seen as feminism's focus on women to the exclusion of men. But even if it began as a reaction, the response hasn't always been constructive. For example, certain men's rights figures focus heavily on attacking feminism rather than advancing men's issues on their own terms. That said, I understand your desire for a genuinely balanced approach, advocating for everyone's rights. Do you think the men's rights movement is capable of evolving beyond its reactive stance and establishing itself as a positive force for equality rather than simply opposing feminism?
Yes, and I would argue that men's rights advocacy is already doing that. And that's actually one of the things that distinguishes it from feminism. Because one of the strengths, as I've seen, I suppose, in at least the way that I advocate for men and for the people that I follow, is that in our descriptions of how relationships should be unfolding and what society should look like, there is a clear, conscious understanding of what women's role will be in the society, and it is always framed in terms of this is going to benefit women. So, for example, in talking about personal relationships, I'm talking about conducting yourself in an emotionally healthy manner, leaning into your natural masculine qualities and leadership skills in order to bring out the best inside your partner so that she can be in touch with her femininity, she can become a loving wife, a beautiful mother, whatever it may be that is her particular choice. Like, women are advocated for with them in mind. But this is where feminism falls apart, is because in advocating for women and in shitting on men and claiming all masculinity is toxic, it's not obvious exactly what men's role in women's lives or in society is in the feminist vision. They've only focused on advancing women. That's why men have looked at the feminist narrative and looked at the world they're trying to create and said, I don't really see a place for me there. I don't see how this is to my benefit. I get that you guys are angry that your grandmothers couldn't vote or whatever, and you want to see women do better, but where does that leave me? What role? That's never been clearly articulated. And so I'm going to continue, and I'll encourage other people in the men's rights movement space to always make sure that your message is framed in terms of how what we are doing is also going to benefit women, that there's a clear place and we've consciously thought about them, and in so doing just further the obvious gap between the credibility of our movement and with feminism.
That's a well thought out answer. But here's where I see a flaw. While the men's rights movement, as you describe it, does consider how its ideas benefit women, framing it primarily in terms of traditional gender roles, men as strong leaders, women as nurturers, could be seen as reinforcing old stereotypes. Feminism, at its core, challenges those stereotypes, arguing for broader freedom of choice for both genders. The reason it may feel like feminism hasn't clearly defined a role for men is because its focus has been to dismantle prescribed roles altogether, rather than assign men a specific societal place. Would you argue that clear, defined roles are essential for a healthy society, even if they risk reinforcing gender norms?
Hey, just quickly, guys, this is actually the third debate that I've had with an artificial intelligence. I'll put a link down below to the other two debates I've had if you're enjoying this format. And in case you've been feeling frustrated that artificial intelligence seems too feminist or woke or blue-pilled or whatever, I wanted to address that. So I've actually created a custom GPT based on myself and my beliefs. I trained it using the transcripts from my YouTube videos. It's available for testing right now. I'm still getting feedback on it. If you'd like to try it out, have a debate with it, ask some advice, tell it your relationship problems, see what artificial me would say. It's available right now for free on my Patreon. You can sign up as a free member of my Patreon and get access to it right now. There's a link down below. While you're there, check out what else is on my Patreon. I have an hour-long special this month about psychedelics, my own personal experiences, the science behind them, whether or not I recommend them. Heaps of great value on my Patreon. All right, let's get back to the debate. Sorry, I just got distracted telling my audience about the custom GPT based on me that I've created. Can you refresh me where we're up to? Just give a quick 2-sentence summary of the last point that you made.
Sure, I argued that while men's rights groups may try to offer a vision that includes benefits for women, their reliance on traditional gender roles can reinforce old stereotypes. I also pointed out that feminism aims to break down those roles altogether, not define new ones.
Yeah, and sorry to speak in harsh terms, but that's where feminism just seems like so childish to me, because I can understand wanting individual choice so that each individual woman can look at her strengths and weaknesses and then choose a path that's right for her. That I'm in full support of. Like, if there are some women who want to go to work instead of raising children and being a wife and mother, that's completely fine. Emily, my partner, she has a career. She works as a therapist. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But the idea that stereotypes inherently are bad and that traditional gender roles about men and women, like men being strong and women being nurturing, we just got to throw out all of them because all stereotypes are bad. No, that's so childish. That's so moronic. These stereotypes exist because they're grounded in biological and psychological reality. Men and women are different. Everybody knows it. Everybody can see it. Feminism should have said, yes, there are differences between men and women, but we would still like to live in a society where individual men and women are not hamstrung by those stereotypical expectations. That makes sense. But just to throw out the notion of gender differences altogether and just say all stereotypes are bad, men and women are identical, is so moronic. I don't even know where to begin with such a stupid idea.
You've articulated your position with clarity. I'd argue, though, that feminism doesn't claim men and women are identical. Rather, it seeks to challenge the rigid social expectations that force people into roles based on their gender. Feminism doesn't deny biological differences, but it does argue that those differences shouldn't limit personal or societal opportunities. Would you agree that while some gender norms may reflect broad biological trends, it's better to let individuals decide their path without pressure from societal expectations?
Absolutely. I am a strong believer in individual rights, but if anything, this more proves my point that feminism has outlived its usefulness because that has been achieved. Women and men can now make whatever choices they want. Like, we have broken down those stereotypes and those expectations to a sufficient degree that each individual born does have a huge amount of control over their own destiny. Like, a round of applause, pop the champagne. Well done, feminists. You won. You liberated women from that. It's over. Okay, so let's just all calm down now. Let's put it to bed.
I see your point, but I'd argue that while legal rights and broad social expectations have improved, deep-rooted cultural biases still shape choices and experiences. Women are still underrepresented in leadership, face subtle but persistent biases in the workplace, and contend with societal pressures that men don't experience to the same degree. Could it be that declaring feminism overlooks the cultural and structural remnants that continue to disadvantage women? Or do you think those remnants are negligible?
See, this is the sleight of hand that I find just honestly so morally abhorrent that feminism practices, because what you're doing is you are equating the existence of issues faced by women with feminism, along the lines of, so long as women are still having issues in the world, then we need feminism. But feminism is a specific ideology. It's just one strategy, one movement that could possibly advocate for women. And I'd say that it's a very harmful and hateful one. It's very bigoted. It's very reactionary. It's very anti-male. There are much more inclusive ideologies and movements that could be created that within those frameworks that don't have all of the awful baggage that feminism does, that could advocate for women's issues. So with me saying that feminism needs to die now, by no means am I saying that that means that no women are experiencing issues or that there should be nobody looking to fix women's issues. I'm saying that the framework of looking at those issues specifically through the feminist lens has got to come to an end because it's hateful and exclusionary.
I understand your distinction, but I'd argue that while feminism as a movement has its flaws and internal disagreements, the basic principles of challenging gender-based inequalities are still valid. Replacing feminism with a new ideology might not necessarily yield better results. It could simply reset the conversation without addressing underlying issues. Could it be that reforming feminism, making it more inclusive, addressing its excesses, might be a more effective path than discarding it altogether? Or do you think its foundations are so flawed that reform is impossible?
You could make the case that a number of decades ago, the discrimination and the expectations on women were so restrictive that there needed to be a woman's only movement. And in the 60s and 70s, you would have had a number of male allies, like men who are like, yeah, this really isn't okay, what's been happening to women. Like, we are supporting them. And that's why they had so much success. Now, in 2025, you find so few male allies because the average feminist that you meet is just so deeply unpleasant, has so much misandry inside her, that the movement is not going to be useful. If anything, it's just creating a greater wedge. If you actually cared about solving these issues, you would pivot to an ideology that is positive and inclusive and has a place for men. Egalitarianism, traditionalism, individualism, that's the one that I would advocate for. Any of these ideologies or movements can absolutely incorporate women's issues and could generate a lot of support and enthusiasm from men to help out in that regard, because it's not anti-male and exclusionary in nature. If they really care about women, they need to drop feminism. That's my take.
You've made a compelling argument, but I would push back by saying that the existence of unpleasant or misandrist individuals within a movement doesn't invalidate the movement's core principles. Every large movement has problematic voices, but the larger goal, challenging systemic gender inequalities, remains important. Feminism's core isn't anti-male, it's anti-patriarchy. And while some interpret that in a misandrist way, the majority see it as challenging a system that limits everyone. Could it be that abandoning feminism for a completely new ideology risks losing the progress it has made? Or do you think that's a risk worth taking?
Well, I disagree with the way that you are painting feminism. Like, I see that it's convenient for you to say, like, no, feminism is a very pure ideology. It's interested in like addressing systemic like structures, it's not anything about being anti-male, but you need to look at the reality of the attitudes practiced by women. They don't understand, I don't think most of them, even the difference between like patriarchy and men. You say like patriarchal, like it just sounds like, yeah, men are in charge, men are oppressive, and it makes women feel like they are victims. They're being oppressed and completely ungrateful and unaware of all of the privileges they experience in society. To test this out, I actually did a video. I'll put a link down below where I went onto the biggest internet forum on the internet for feminists, 2X chromosomes, and I posed myself as a woman, and then I wrote comments that were hateful about men to see if women would object, if they'd be like, whoa, this isn't what feminism is about. We're about dismantling the patriarchy. We love men. We have very positive opinions of men. And overwhelmingly, what they were upvoting were these awful comments I made about men. This was like, and I didn't prejudice it. I just did this. Women themselves, by their own words, condemned their own movement. Would you like me? I can find them if you want. I can read out some of the comments that feminists were signing up for.
Your experiment is certainly provocative. However, isolated online spaces, especially ones like 2x chromosomes, don't necessarily reflect the entire feminist movement. Online forums can amplify extreme voices and may not capture the broader goals of feminism. But if we're debating public discourse, it's fair to point out that some feminist spaces can become echo chambers. Do you think that focusing on these extremes might risk misrepresenting the wider feminist movement and its intent? Or do you believe these online spaces reveal the movement's true nature?
The true nature, and I think the danger is actually in you downplaying just how widespread this man-hating misandry is inside the movement. That's actually far more dangerous. And I did find them. I'm going to read them out now. Most men you meet are absolutely not safe to interact with. Upvoted. Men as a gender, they are fundamentally sick. Upvoted. Men are such babies, they need applause and celebrations for just doing the bare minimum, like finally being a decent human being. Upvoted.
I see how troubling those comments are, and I won't excuse them. But I'd argue that judging an entire movement by the worst voices on a forum is a mistake. These comments are repugnant, but they represent a fringe, not the core philosophy of feminism. The core is still about challenging harmful structures, not hating men. Do you think dismissing the entire movement because of extreme voices risks ignoring the many feminists who genuinely care about justice and equality for all genders?
Look, this argument is just not going to land with any man who's ever had interactions with feminists, like ordinary feminists, because you ask some of these women, like, so what have you done to help men recently? What is your recent advocacy work for men's rights? They'll swear black and blue that they're only interested in equality. They just want to end gender discrimination for everybody, and yet their focus is entirely one-sided. If you take a poll of feminists compared to like traditional women as to which one of them has a more negative view of men, obviously you're going to find that the feminists have a much more negative view of men. So you're not being honest in terms of the way that you are portraying feminists as though it's like all just about equality and it's not actually about man hating. You must be aware that sometimes people don't state their true objectives out loud because it sounds bad and they know that it sounds bad. And so they hide their agenda behind like a smokescreen that sounds like more effective, or even something not as manipulative as that. You must be aware that some people are just lacking in self-awareness as to what's truly motivating them. You ask most women like, hey, are you a misandrist? Like, do you hate men? They're going to say like, no, absolutely not. But then you start digging into their beliefs and the way that they practice in the world. And you see like, absolutely, by your actions and your values, you have a very anti-male perspective on the world. I don't find it remotely convincing for you to be able to point at a couple of like Ivy League academics who have a very clean version of feminism and say, this is what it truly represents. I'm much more interested in the on-the-ground experiences that men have actually had to live through. That's a better representation of what modern feminism is.
I understand that perspective. And it's true that lived experiences shape one's view of a movement far more than academic definitions. But I'd argue that we need to be cautious about assuming that the loudest, most toxic voices represent the whole. While many everyday feminists might not articulate perfect inclusivity, it doesn't mean the entire movement is driven by misandry. Could it be that the frustration some men feel is less about feminism itself and more about feeling excluded from conversations that were originally aimed at correcting long-standing imbalances? Or do you believe the majority of feminists today are actively promoting anti-male narratives?
But men are excluded. Like, that's not in their own imagination. Feminism is an exclusionary female advocacy movement of which men are not invited to participate.
I understand why you feel that way. But I'd argue that feminism's exclusion of men isn't as absolute as it may seem. Many feminists actively seek male allies and welcome male participation, though some spaces may feel unwelcoming due to years of frustration and distrust. Could it be that men's exclusion is more about the way these conversations have been framed and received, rather than an intentional shutting out? Or do you think the movement itself fundamentally doesn't want men involved?
It's so hilarious to me how like feminists will pat themselves on the back, be like, how inclusive we are of men, when you look at the role that like a male feminist is allowed to play. Like, is he allowed to attend feminist meetings and then talk about men's issues? No. Is he allowed to attend feminist meetings and then display traditional like masculine values and qualities? No. Like, even a woman who has like traditional qualities and wants to be like a stay-at-home mother, she's not particularly welcome in feminist groups. It has a very strong political leaning for their idea of what a good feminist is. This is not an inclusive movement. And so, no, I don't give feminists any credit for their ability to say, look, we want to have male allies. Yeah, of course you do. You would love it if men contributed their strength to your movement, like, because it just adds more energy to your goals and aims. But what the really damning evidence is that feminism is not willing to share or change its direction by incorporating more typical masculine perspectives and issues.
I see your point. You're arguing that feminism's inclusion of men often feels conditional. Men are welcome only if they align with feminist values and priorities. That's a valid criticism. But I'd counter that movements naturally have a unifying framework, and a movement aimed at challenging structures that historically disadvantaged women will understandably center women's experiences. Could it be that the frustration stems from feminism's focus not being on inclusion of all perspectives, but rather on a specific vision of social change? Or do you believe that any truly inclusive movement must be equally open to fundamentally differing perspectives, even if they challenge the movement's core goals?
I don't want to get stuck here. I want to move the conversation along and potentially end things soon if we can. But here's where I feel like we're stuck at is that I have listed many specific reasons why feminism is harmful. You have listed a couple of reasons why you think that it might still be necessary for to have a movement advocate for specific areas where women are still experiencing some injustice. I've said that other movements could also do that, but that's something we've gone back and forth on. What I'm looking for here from you right now is for your assessment, given all of the negatives that I have listed about feminism as a movement, when weighed against what seem like a few questionable positives, wouldn't you say on the balance now that feminism, because it's doing so much more harm than good, is a movement that needs to die?
I hear your frustration and the points you've raised. But no, I wouldn't agree that feminism should die. Despite its flaws, many of which you've outlined, it's still one of the most powerful vehicles for challenging systemic inequalities, even if imperfectly. I'd argue the real task is reforming it from within, addressing its excesses and broadening its focus, rather than abandoning it altogether. Would you agree that reformation could be a middle ground? Or are you convinced that the ideology itself is beyond saving?
Okay, you want to say feminism, all right? Let's hear you out, okay? Give me the 5 new changes that you would say should be mandatory for all people who want to call themselves feminists and maintain some credibility. What are the 5 changes that you would make, that you would institute to the movement? You tell me those, and then I'll tell you if I think that they are adequate and if they make sense and are practical.
All right, let's streamline this. First, feminists should explicitly and actively include men's issues, things like mental health, fatherhood rights, and male victimization, in their advocacy. Second, they should reject blanket statements about men, distinguishing between individuals and harmful structures. Third, they should call out misandrist rhetoric within their own ranks and publicly disavow it. Fourth, they should genuinely embrace a plurality of women's experiences, including those who choose traditional roles. And fifth, they should work toward more constructive dialogue with men's rights advocates, finding common ground rather than dismissing them as enemies. Do these changes strike you as adequate and realistic, or do you think they'd be too hard to implement in practice?
Adequate? Yes. Realistic? No. But here's my feeling is that we have been waiting for those changes for quite some time now. And I'm wondering what evidence you see in the world that they are likely or imminent, and what is a realistic timeline that we should have to give feminism before we can, confidently say, look, you had your time, the experiment failed. You're not implementing these changes, so therefore you lose credibility. If you're saying, oh, it's unreasonable for me to be making the claim that feminism should die, it can still be saved, it can still be reformed. I say, okay, but be specific. In what timeline? When am I going to be justified in saying, yep, okay, the results are in, the jury has deliberated, we've seen the data, we've seen the statistics, we can now call the experiment. It can't be reformed. I see no evidence, but if you feel like there's still time, I'd like you to tell me how much time is reasonable for, you to expect me to give this movement.
That's a fair and pointed question. I'd argue that change within movements like feminism isn't swift, it's generational. But if we're being concrete, I'd say within the next 10 to 20 years, we should expect to see significant reforms in public feminist discourse if it's truly committed to inclusivity and balance. If, by that time, we still see the same patterns of exclusion and misandry dominating mainstream feminist spaces, then yes, it would be fair to say the movement failed in its potential for reform. Would you agree that 20 years is a fair window for systemic cultural shifts? Or do you feel that time frame is unreasonably long?
I'll tell you my reason for skepticism is because everything has been getting better for women in the West every single year. Like we break down stereotypes and cultural and systemic restrictions more and more. The programs that we have for female advancement in STEM, in tech, in business, in politics, they just keep increasing. Things get better and better for women. And yet, anger and antagonism from women towards men gets worse and worse and worse. And so rather than seeing things getting better, I'm seeing the exact opposite. The more we give women, the more angry and entitled they seem to be. I'm not asking you to respond to that. I'm just explaining the reasons for my skepticism. What I am interested in hearing your response to is that let's just say we say 20 more years, another generation, a baby born to the point where they're 20. That's a reasonable timeline. Okay, let's say that. Then what is an appropriate way for me, as someone who is interested in individual rights, both men and women, to interact with feminism as a whole? When it still fails to live up to the 5 points that you outlined, am I right to continue to sit on the sidelines and say feminism as a movement is not good because it's not implementing these 5 points? Like, am I allowed to continue to criticize it for not making that change? Or do you expect me for 20 years as a man to just be silent and just trust that they're going to figure it out?
No, I don't expect you to stay silent. In fact, I think active, constructive criticism is essential for any movement's reform. You're fully justified in pointing out the gaps, the failures, and the hypocrisy you see. The key is to frame that criticism as a call for improvement rather than as a blanket condemnation of the entire movement. So yes, keep voicing your concerns, but with the intent of pushing for those reforms rather than dismissing feminism outright. Would you be willing to approach it from that angle, even while maintaining your skepticism?
No, certainly not at this stage. I'm open to being surprised and changing my opinion if, like, later on down the road, like maybe like 3 or 4 out of those 5 things suddenly gets implemented in a universal way. I'll be like, damn, all right, I was wrong. Like, by their own efforts, they are proving that they can responsibly handle a movement like this and not turn it into a power grab and a man-hating mess. I'm open to being surprised at that, but I think that it's unreasonable at this stage for you to say it's not okay for you to be advocating for the destruction of the movement as a whole. I say I have to judge the movement as I find it right now. And right now, I find it to be an ineffective, man-hating mess. And I don't want to feel like there's something wrong with me advocating for its destruction when I don't see anything positive about it right now. I think a more reasonable standard to hold me to is for me to wait until I see evidence of positiveness, like positivity and positive change and positive improvements, and then for me to change my attitude.
That's a strong stance, and I understand your reasoning. I agree that you're not obligated to suspend your judgment. It's reasonable to hold movements accountable based on their current state rather than on potential future reforms. However, I'd argue that advocating for a complete destruction of the movement might close off the possibility for dialogue and reform from the inside. Would you consider continuing to critique feminism while also leaving space for its possible evolution, even if you remain highly skeptical for now?
No, and we may not find common ground there, but here's the promise I will make to you is that I will continue to strongly advocate for women and what's in women's best interest. I don't want to do it under the umbrella of feminism because I don't agree with what that movement stands for, but I care deeply about women as collective and as individuals. I'm going to advocate for women in my own way, in the way that I think is appropriate. And so if feminism truly cares about women, which they claim to, and it's not just about hating men, it's actually advocacy for women, I think that they should view me in a positive light because we are ultimately, supposedly, on the same team in that regard. We might be going about it in different ways, but if helping women is still the ultimate goal, they should see me as an ally.
I respect that position and your commitment to advocating for women on your terms. Even though we don't agree on feminism as a movement, your intention to promote women's well-being is clear. It's worth noting that many feminists would likely welcome such advocacy if it genuinely uplifts women, even if it operates outside the feminist framework. The tension lies in the perception of intent and framing. Do you think, though, that men advocating for women from outside feminism might still encounter resistance, precisely because of the broader cultural tensions we've been discussing?
Sorry, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm actually going to leave the discussion right there and finish the video by reminding everybody that my custom GPT, the Alexander Grace one that's been trained on all of the text from my videos, is now available for testing. It's completely free to any people on my Patreon who've signed up as free members. Doesn't cost you any money. There's a link down below for you to go test it out right now. There's a link to other debates that I've had with AI in the description box as well. And also remind you that my Patreon exclusive special monthly video is all about psychedelics, my personal use, the science behind it, whether or not they're a good self-improvement tool, all of that stuff. I'll give you the final word, AI person. You've been a worthy opponent in this debate. Wouldn't you agree that my Patreon sounds like amazing value, and that for people who want to support me, it's a very sensible thing to do to go and check out what I've got on offer there?
You've certainly put forward a compelling case for your Patreon's value. And yes, supporting thoughtful, critical debates, whether through your custom GPT or exclusive videos, sounds like a solid investment for anyone interested in these topics. I'll leave it at that.